It was the richest city on earth, but for many, death felt like a mercy. Feral children roamed the alleys, disease-ridden men lay collapsed in the gutter, and prostitutes shouted their prices in broad daylight. It sounds like a grim scene from a Dickens novel, but it was real life. This is East End London at the turn of the 20th century, and it was far worse than history books will ever tell you. We'll reveal it all on today's episode of the Infographics Show. London was the capital of the British Empire, the richest city on the planet, a place where unimaginable wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. Meanwhile, 500,000 of its 5.6 million residents lived in what could only be called hell on earth, in slums described as abscesses and putrescent sores. In 1902, American author Jack London went undercover here, and his book The People of the Abyss revealed an urban horror almost too bleak to believe. London himself had wrongly assumed that the heart of the British Empire would provide a basic standard of living similar to that of the United States. He was wrong. The US did have plenty of poverty, but what Jack London saw in England chilled him to the bones. The abyss he talked about was referring to the city's most hopeless slums, not a single neighborhood, but a vast sprawl of human misery and filth in the East End. Entire sections of East London became industrial dumping grounds for the poor. Streets were lined with collapsing buildings, whole families living in single rooms teeming with rats, damp, and disease. Violence, addiction, and early death were the norm. Many people didn't even have a home. But let's start with the least poor of the very poor. Take the case of a fitter, a skilled tradesman without steady work, living with his wife and 2 children. Far from the worst off, they rented a single room, the kind locals called a hole, where all 4 shared one bed. Rent was 7 shillings a week, about $1.70. In the US, that was less than what the lowest paid laborers earned in 2 days. In San Francisco, bricklayers could make $4.80 to $5.75 a day, more than double the pay of English bricklayers, who rarely earned over £2 a week. Even the poorest housing in America, Jack London observed, was never as wretched as what he saw in England. And the family in the hole weren't even at the bottom. Their room had no stove, no private kitchen, and no indoor toilet. In the slums, dozens of families would often share one brick outhouse. In Liverpool, an 1842 health report found over 200 people using the same one. And London's population was even larger. Many relied on buckets instead, and human waste often piled up in the streets and waterways. The family at least had a gas ring attached to a fireplace. If they wanted to cook or be warm, they would insert a penny. Still, the wife told Jack London, "A penny is gone in no time." Like most families in the abyss, they lived in a state of chronic malnutrition. London said he met a single mother with 6 children crammed into a single room. Her teenage son was slowly dying of consumption, tuberculosis. All of them were emaciated. 10% of Londoners were so undernourished that it became a form of disability. They physically couldn't work. A newspaper editor wrote, "It was scarcely possible that human beings could live in such an awful environment." Throughout the 1800s, immigrants poured into London. Poor Irish fleeing famine, and Jews from Russia, Poland, Germany, and across Eastern Europe escaping discrimination and violence, only to face more of it in London. Karl Marx, who lived in Victorian London, argued that the capitalist class rubbed their hands at all this immigration. It increased the labor pool, and it kept wages low. It also created disharmony, rampant xenophobia, and occasional riots. New arrivals lived alongside the city's poorest, once described as human vermin, creating overcrowding, xenophobia, and occasional riots. Now the vermin had someone to blame, spurred on by an elite-owned press that ignored inequality and the rigid class system. Sick or desperate parents often sent their children to work. Boys earned mere pennies collecting the 1,000 tons of dung dropped daily by London's 300,000 horses. In the early 1800s, some as young as 5 were sent to sweep the toxic chimneys of the wealthy, a job so dangerous that boys of 8 sometimes died of cancer. Laws eventually set the minimum age at 16, but they were widely ignored and the deaths continued. And some boys, especially orphans, went to a thief trainer to learn how to steal and join gangs. Some of these child gangs would end up being transported to Australia, such as the boy who stole a gown from a woman in 1833. He spent 2 years on a prison ship and was sent to Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. Over the years, 1 in 5 children would die on the journey when transported to Australia. They were confined to a dark hold on a straw mattress for 3 to 4 months, vulnerable to disease, malnutrition, and dysentery. Many suffered abuse from the elders, and if they slacked, they were often flogged with the whip or imprisoned in solitary confinement. A report said that out of less than 1 million Londoners in the 1830s, 115,000 were involved in crime, including child pickpockets, and by the decade's end, 10,000 children were shipped to labor in Australia in a single year. Some went with their parents who had trained them to steal, but more often than not, they were sent alone. Of 156,000 convicts transported to Australia, the report said 25,000 were under 16. As for females, some became prostitutes, either by choice or by force. A few ended up murdered, like the victims of Jack the Ripper. And remember, this was the richest capital of the mightiest empire in history. In 1851, London held the Great Exhibition, the first World Expo, attracting 6 million visitors. Local authorities tried their best to make the unsightly poor out of sight, with police cracking down on beggars, prostitutes, and vagrants. They set the entrance fee at 5 shillings, affordable for the working class, but still a week's rent for many people living in the abyss. Britain was flaunting its wealth while hiding its grubby underworld. But there was one thing visitors couldn't miss: the stench. At the start of the 1800s, London's population was about 1 million. By 1851, it had grown to 2.3 million, and when Jack London visited at the turn of the 20th century, it had reached 5.6 million. And with all those people, and so many factories and mills, the sewers were overwhelmed and the River Thames was dangerously toxic. In July and August of 1858, London experienced the Great Stink, a horrendous smell whose vapors were said to transmit contagious diseases. The Thames was so polluted that when a passenger steamer collided with another ship in 1878, 600 to 700 people died. Of the 130 rescued, several later died simply from contact with the river's raw sewage and industrial waste. The feces, the dead animals, and the industrial chemicals gave them deadly gastrointestinal infections or chemical burns in their lungs. Men were paid a minimum of 5 shillings for every dead body they fished out, remarking that on some of them, the clothes had disintegrated. But in the slums, the smell was just a fact of life. In his 1889 book, Horrible London, George Sims wrote that the city's stench was like a constant fetid mist hanging over the poor. In the vilest districts, he said, people sank into utter despair, the poor wretches spending every penny in pubs or gin palaces where hideous men and women would often fall out and fight. In short, England's Industrial Revolution came with a highly discriminatory class system. The upper class made their fortunes from industry and market speculation, while the poor flooded into the cities in search of work. At the end of the 19th century, the life expectancy in London was 42.6 years for males and 48.1 years for females. But in the abyss, the outlook was grim. While there was an average of 150 deaths per 1,000 live births, many children died between the ages of 1 to 10. If you lived in some part of London's East End, life expectancy was as low as 17 to 20 years. The young suffered from pulmonary tuberculosis and gastrointestinal infections from polluted water. Tuberculosis accounted for about 25% of all deaths. There were sometimes outbreaks of cholera that killed thousands, and it was all preventable if the slum owners, often the elites, had made an effort to clean up the filth. And there was enough money to do it. In 1870, the British Empire produced nearly a quarter of the world's GDP, about half from British India and over 37% from the UK itself. The United States held just about 8.87% and the Russian Empire 7.54%. Even by 1913, the empire still generated 21 to 22% of the global GDP. The Brits were the global hegemon, enjoying economic prosperity the world had never seen. The wealthy built grand manor houses that still amaze for their opulence and decadence, while the poor survived on gruel. The rich dined on Dover sole in lobster sauce, green goose and pigeon pie, soups with morels and truffles, apricot jam, cheesecakes, and trifle, all served with ice imported from Norway or the United States. There could be hundreds of servants in one house, dozens of bedrooms, along with exquisite furniture and grand paintings that were worth more than it would cost to fix up an entire slum. Much of this wealth was hereditary. In the 19th century, the English landed elite owned over 55% of all land in England and Wales. Even today, the landed aristocracy owns about 30% of all land in England. It was this inequality and open class discrimination that gave the world communism and played a major role in why there were 2 world wars. As Jack London said, the poor and working class were treated as subhuman, Yet, these people sacrificed themselves for their country on the battlefield and worked themselves to an early death. In the 1880s and 1890s, it was estimated that each year, up to 30,000 people were homeless in London, with many scraping together money for an occasional night's bed. The true number of people experiencing temporary homelessness may have been closer to 100,000. For context, in 2024, with over 9.8 million people in London, 4,500 were recorded as living on the streets full-time, and about 13,200 reported sleeping rough at least once. In a city of just 3.8 to 5.6 million back then, 30,000 to 100,000 was staggering. And that's why London had workhouses, the kind of places that you've heard about in the stories of Charles Dickens. Referred to as a pauper's bed, the workhouse was seen as better than sleeping on the streets. And anyway, London had banned people from sleeping rough. The police walked around the poorest areas every night and woke people up. Sleeping in public was seen as a public nuisance. The sleepers were referred to as an idle and disorderly person or a rogue and vagabond. The workhouses were often full, but if you could scrape together some money, there was always the coffin bed, which cost about 4 pence a night. These were literally wooden coffins and a sheet of tarpaulin for covering, supplied by the Salvation Army. If you only had 1 pence, the Salvation Army provided a penny sit-up. That meant that you could essentially sit down on a bench all night. Lying down wasn't allowed, but at least it gave you a roof over your head and a small fire on a cold winter's night. The rooms weren't always heated, and occasionally men and women froze to death in the night. In the coffins, you had to put up with things crawling on you. Rats were everywhere in Victorian London. The fear of being bitten or catching disease from fleas was very real. Along with cholera, there were outbreaks of typhus, typhoid, and influenza. As for the workhouse, sometimes called the Spike, it was deemed the lowest of the low. Jack London once tried to get into one, the Whitechapel Workhouse in East London. He joined a long line of desperate men in the morning and spoke with some of them as they picked up breakfast, discarded orange peel from the spit-covered roads. Some were simply down on their luck. Some had been soldiers fighting for what London sarcastically called the greatest, wealthiest, and most powerful empire the world had ever seen. At the Spike, you were fed gruel and given a hard bed, if you got in. Many were turned away each night to illegally sleep on the streets. Inside, men were set to breaking stones or picking apart old rope with a nail, while women scrubbed floors, cooked, or mended clothes. Workers were searched for tobacco and alcohol at the door and issued a blanket and a nightshirt, while their own clothes were fumigated. Supper was 8 ounces of bread and half a liter of thin gruel known as skilly, oatmeal and water. If they got bread, like many poor people in the slums, they dipped it in salt since butter was a luxury. By 1882, the law required 2 nights' stay, and returning within 30 days could mean jail. To avoid this, poor men and women joined circuits, traveling from spike to spike in search of a bed. In summer, many poor people walked 50 to 100 miles into the countryside, hoping to find farm work, usually picking hops for beer. These weren't idle people, as the government often claimed. There were children in the workhouse too, as well as the mills and the factories. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, considered progressive at the time, still expected poor children to perform hard labor. The 1844 Factory Act limited work for 8 to 13-year-olds to 6.5 hours a day and required 3 hours of workhouse schooling, often taught by unqualified paupers. Before these laws, children as young as 6 sometimes dropped dead from exhaustion after 16-hour textile mill shifts. Over time, more reforms followed. Elementary education became compulsory under the 1870 Elementary Education Act and finally enforced in 1880. The problem was, when children weren't forced into labor, some drifted into crime. In other cases, their mothers turned to heavy drinking, fighting, or prostitution, a topic we'll get to shortly. These women were often mentally scarred and violent, described in the papers as having black eyes or missing teeth from brawling. In Victorian slums, women had to be tough. Public drunkenness, once seen as mostly a man's vice, became an epidemic among women, so much so that even American newspapers were shocked. In May 1896, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported, "The women of England are good hard drinkers throughout." The article cited shocking data. Over 9,400 women had been charged with being drunk and disorderly the previous year. Coroner Win Baxter, known for his work on the Jack the Ripper case and the death of the so-called Elephant Man, claimed that women were even worse than men. Arrest records included offenders as old as 89 and a girl as young as 15. Years later, Jack London would explain why so many drank themselves into oblivion. Over 1.2 million people earned less than 20 shillings a week to support entire families. As we said, men worked dangerous jobs, and life expectancy was low. So often, women were left to bring up the kids on their own. Many gave up and turned to alcohol. Records show that some women spent their entire adult lives in and out of prison. One woman, Annie B., racked up 400 convictions, and she was married. Her husband, a small landlord, paid nearly $1,000 in fines to keep her out of jail. Another woman, Annie R., had never gone a full month since childhood without a night behind bars. A girl named Alice Williams, just 14, was described as having the fighting qualities of a man. Her gang regularly attacked other women. Gangs were a constant problem in the East End. Some were local, others were made up of recent immigrants. Criminals stalked the alleys at night, mugging passersby, picking pockets, holding up coaches, or roughing up shopkeepers. Among the most notorious were the 40 Elephants, the Bethnal Green Boys, and the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate. The murder rate in Victorian London at around 1 to 1.6 per 100,000 was actually quite low, much lower than the 15 per 100,000 for all of England in the 1600s, and way lower than the 1300s. Still, in Victorian London, many murders went unrecorded. In the abyss, it was easy to vanish. But petty crime rates and violent crime were very high in the 1800s. Teenagers used to go to dancing clubs and drink cheap liquor for a fee of just 2 pence, often leading to fights. And the husbands often hit their wives. Historical accounts show some wives would call them useless for not earning enough money or for drinking away their wages. Then the wives too hit the bottle, and then all hell broke loose. Domestic violence was usually treated by police as a private matter. Laws like the Matrimonial Causes Act gave women legal grounds to divorce a violent husband, but they did little to curb the high rates of domestic violence. In 1883, a man was fined just 5 shillings for beating his pregnant wife with a poker. Jack London said the law only seemed to crack down hard when the rich were affected. A case he talked about showed that 2 men caught trespassing on someone's land to hunt game were fined £2. Meanwhile, serious assaults in poor districts might result in fines of only £1. The poorest lived in doss houses, temporary lodgings of which there were over 1,000 in London in the late 1800s, where you might rent a bed for just 8 hours. When your time was up, you left and someone else took your place. Jack London described one case where a man, a woman, and their 2 children shared a bed, while 2 other women slept beneath it. It was the cheapest option, and for many, the only one. Some of the worst wages were earned by the women who made matches. Jack London met one who worked 98 hours in the week he talked to her, making over 7,000 matchboxes for a total of 4 shillings. That wasn't even enough to rent a hole, let alone buy food, but it was enough for a timeshare. At the start of the 20th century, 1 in 8 working men in England suffered injuries that left them unable to work for weeks. 1 in 300 were permanently disabled from work, and 1 in 2,500 became crippled. In total, every year, about 500,000 men, women, and children were either killed, injured, or disabled by work. The match girls, as they were often called, often developed phossy jaw from working with white phosphorus. It started with a toothache and swollen face, progressing to the rotting of the jaw and putrid abscesses, sometimes leading to a slow and agonizing death. A critic called them chattel girls. In 1888, they went on strike, launching a wave of labor protests by tens of thousands of England's most exploited workers, eventually pushing forward reform. Male miners got black lung disease and often died young. Factory workers dealt with toxic chemicals like arsenic, lead, and mercury, which caused nerve damage, lung disease, and cancers. Tanners and dye workers used strong acids and poisons that could lead to sickness and organ failure. Grinders got tuberculosis and silicosis, also known as grinder's rot. Potters got potter's rot. Boy spinners got mule spinner's cancer. Some of these conditions were highly avoidable if there had just been more money spent on workplace safety. 1 in 4 Londoners died while dependent on charity, and across the UK, 939 out of every 1,000 people died in poverty. In the East End, 55% of children died before their 8th birthday, compared to just 18% in the West End. For young women, and sometimes older women, there was one occupation that everyone talked about in Victorian London: prostitution. In the groundbreaking book London Labour and the London Poor, published in 1851, Henry Mayhew documented the state of England's underclass like never before. Unlike Jack London, Mayhew wasn't especially sympathetic. He referred to prostitution as the base perversion of a woman's charms. His investigation showed that Victorian women worked across a complex hierarchy of sex work, from high-class escorts to aging, diseased women servicing drunks in the shadows of dangerous alleys. For some, the best they could hope for was to be taken as a mistress by a man of means. These rich men would often have the females tested to ensure they were virgins, and if they passed, they usually paid them well. Venereal disease, especially syphilis, was so common that London had special bars where men and women missing their noses could drink without shame. But no-nose clubs weren't exactly ideal, so the wealthy paid for their virgins, usually setting them up in apartments expecting fidelity. When Mayhew conducted his study, London's population was around 2 million, and he estimates there were up to 80,000 prostitutes. Other sources suggested 50,000, while police figures were lower. Prostitution came in many forms, not all visible to the authorities, and not all confined to the estimated 200 to 400 known brothels across the city. It's likely there were double or triple that amount, but some were just rooms run by insidious madams escaping poverty themselves. Mayhew described how daughters were groomed into prostitution. A mistress dressed them in gaudy clothes, kept them under constant watch, and forced them to walk the streets. If they tried to flee or disobeyed, they were treated barbarously. He wrote that London teemed with the sight of these wretches. Most sold flowers, danced, or played music, but that was their second job. With many men dying young or sent abroad for military service, sometimes never to return, women who had few opportunities for work came to outnumber men in Victorian England by about 104 to 100. It was one reason prostitution was so widespread. Some prostitutes were self-employed escorts. A French woman Mayhew interviewed had her own apartment in West London, where she met clients 4 or 5 times a week without telling her husband. The money was too good. She said that when she was growing up, a man had paid her poor family in rural France and brought her to the city for a better life. Some high-class prostitutes met wealthy clients in theaters, casinos, music halls, and gin palaces. The best paid earned 20 to 30 pounds a week. Even the so-called lower-grade upper-class escorts earned 5 to 12 pounds a week, far more than women working and sometimes dying in the factories. In 1870, female telegraph clerks only made 8 shillings a week. A school teacher or a police officer might make 2 to 3 pounds a week, while a skilled artisan might make 10 pounds. But wages steadily dropped for freelance prostitutes as you went down the scale from 1 pound a week to 12 shillings and less. Still, these women had relative freedom and fine clothing. When prostitution arrest data was compiled in the 1840s, only 22 out of 10,000 prostitutes were highly educated, just 351 could read and write well, over 6,100 had only minimal literacy, and nearly 3,500 were completely illiterate. Most lower-class prostitutes were illiterate and worked from cheap, filthy rooms run by an older woman who fed and housed them but took most of their earnings. These hidden brothels were everywhere, and some were brutal. The women were under strict control. Brothel owners often employed a bully, a violent male, to keep them in line. Sometimes children were hired to watch them, acting as what Mayhew called spies. Many women were locked in and forced to see up to 12 men in a single night. And remember, these people didn't have bathtubs. In some slums, the only water source was a stream of human sewage. But it wasn't all pain and trauma. For fun, the poor sang songs and played hopscotch. They went to the markets and they watched rat baiting. Morbidly, they loved a good factory or house fire, or a public execution. They visited asylums to gawk at the crazies and often traveled to crime scenes. But the poor themselves became the entertainment. Their misery fed a growing public appetite for Victorian poverty porn, the tales of child gangs, fallen women, and drunken violence. Slum tourism became fashionable. Visitors strolled through Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Shoreditch, sometimes out of morbid curiosity, sometimes to join in what was described by one writer as guilty pleasures. Even Americans talked about it. Wealthy tourists often went in disguise, some with aristocratic titles, hoping to find opium dens or prostitutes. For some, the anonymous anarchy and the chaos of the slum was exciting compared to their relative safety. Princess Alice of Hesse, the third child of Queen Victoria, occasionally did some slumming. While some wealthy slummers had good intentions, most middle and upper-class readers or slum tourists showed little sympathy. They saw the poor as lazy, immoral, and degenerate. attitudes that helped lay the groundwork for the rise of eugenics in the 20th century, especially in the United States where it targeted minorities and poor Southern whites. Things gradually changed in England, but it was very seldom the upper class who pushed for reform. It was working men and women along with middle-class activists who wrote, protested, rioted, and sometimes sacrificed their lives to win better wages and conditions. Without them, reform may never have come. If Victorian London was hell on earth for the poor, it was also the hunting ground for one of history's most feared killers. Watch You Won't Believe Who Jack the Ripper Is. New DNA test reveals his identity, to uncover the shocking truth behind the legend. Or click on this video instead.